The fluorescent lights hummed their 2 a.m. song as Hannah Clark moved through Mercy General's ICU corridor, and nobody watching would have seen anything remarkable, just another night shift nurse in navy scrubs, dark hair pulled back, eyes forward. 8 months into her tenure at this Norfolk hospital, she perfected the art of invisibility. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. She checked the monitors on room 312 first, then 313, her charting so precise it bordered on military documentation. Each entry exact. Each vital sign recorded to the decimal point. Each observation placed in chronological order with the clarity of an after-action report. The antiseptic smell mixed with floor wax as she moved past the nurse's station, and she didn't notice the way the junior staff parted slightly, the way they deferred without her asking. That was just the effect of competence. That was just the effect of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Room 314 held John Ramirez, and that's where the night always seemed to shift. Ramirez was 43, blind since an IED took his sight 3 years ago in Kandahar, though the hospital charts didn't say Kandahar, just said his service-related injury, and most of the floor staff had already written him off. Too damaged. Too difficult. Too much work for a man who'd never see again anyway. Hannah had heard it in the break room. He's never going to get better. Why are we even trying? It's just sad. But Hannah saw something different when she looked at Ramirez. She saw a man whose body still moved with the precision of someone trained to function in darkness, whose fingers still tracked every sound in his room, whose shoulders straightened whenever footsteps approached. She pushed the cart to his bedside and began the routine check without announcing herself. Some nurses called it bedside manner. Hannah called it operational awareness. Announce your presence, you telegraph your movements. Stay silent, you move like you own the space. Morning, Ramirez, she said, her voice steady and low. The kind of voice that didn't need to be loud. 0245 hours, he replied without hesitation. You're 3 minutes early. She almost smiled. Most people didn't notice things like that. Most people didn't count. She began the 4 safety check, the 3-point verification that separated careful nurses from the others. First, she confirmed the 4 line against the armband. Second, she checked the medication against the chart. Third, she verified the site itself, watching for infiltration, swelling, any sign of compromise. It was a rhythm. It was muscle memory. It was the same 3-point check she performed 1,000 times before, in places where getting it wrong didn't just mean a patient discomfort, it meant someone didn't come home. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this under fire, and she felt Ramirez's body shift slightly, felt him tracking her movements by sound alone. The foot tubing made a soft whisper as she adjusted the drip rate. The plastic bag crinkled. Her gloved hand made that rubber-on-rubber sound as she smoothed the tape at the insertion site. 3-point check, he said quietly. Not a question. Hannah's hands paused for exactly half a second. Just half a second. Then they continued their work like nothing had happened. She finished the adjustment, made a note in his chart, 0247 hours, for patent, site clean, rate verified, and turned to leave. Which unit? Ramirez asked. His sightless eyes pointed toward her but didn't quite fix on her face. They never did. I know the check. Nobody does it that way anymore. Not unless they learned it somewhere hot. Hannah stood at the foot of his bed, one hand on the 4-cart. The question hung in the air between them like something that had weight. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical song. Somewhere down the corridor, a ventilator wheezed its metallic rhythm. She could have deflected. Could have made a joke. Could have pulled the cart forward and walked away like every other nurse on this floor did. Instead, she reached down and squeezed his wrist twice in the dark, the old signal, the one that meant classified, the one that meant understood, the one that meant you weren't alone even though you couldn't see that the person holding your wrist had scars across her knuckles that matched the calendar of her own impossible survival. She felt him exhale. Felt his body settle back into the hospital mattress like he'd been holding tension for months waiting for this moment. Rest, she said. That's all that matters right now. Hannah moved to his chair and adjusted the hospital jacket that hung there, the one he'd arrived in, the one he kept asking for even though it served no practical purpose in a climate-controlled ICU. As she straightened it, she saw the patch. Faded green 5th Special Forces Group insignia sewn into the lining with white thread that had yellowed with age. She didn't touch it. Didn't acknowledge it. Just smoothed the jacket and moved it an inch to the left so he could reach it more easily. Some things didn't need words. Some things just needed understanding. The night shift continued as it always did. She checked monitors. She adjusted drips. She charted observations with the precision that had earned her a reputation as meticulous, maybe a little obsessive. What none of them knew was that the obsession came from places where a single decimal point meant the difference between a soldier walking home or not walking anywhere again. By 03:30 hours, the unit had settled into the particular quiet of deep night, that suspended moment when the world seemed to be holding its breath. Hannah stood at the nurse's station, coffee in hand, black, no sugar, still hot enough to drink without hesitation, and she reviewed the charts in front of her. Room 309, post-op hernia repair, vital stable, pain controlled. Room 311, pneumonia recovering, antibiotics on schedule, oxygen saturation climbing. Room 312, CHF exacerbation, diuretic working, fluid output appropriate. Everything made sense. Everything tracked. Then she pulled Ramirez's file again and her eyes moved across a series of orders that didn't track at all. Lumbar puncture ordered. No fever. No indication of meningitis. No clinical reason at all. She flipped back through his chart. 3 weeks ago, he'd been admitted for a routine evaluation. Cardiovascular workup, standard labs, nothing alarming. The first week of his stay, the orders were appropriate. Basic nursing care. Physical therapy to help him navigate his new reality. Then about 10 days in, the orders started. MRI of his spine. CT of his abdomen. Blood work panels that seemed to duplicate previous results. And now a spinal tap, a procedure that carried risks, that required sedation, that made no medical sense for a blind veteran recovering from amputation adjustment. She checked the ordering physician. Dr. Sterling. Every unusual order. Every expensive, unnecessary intervention. Every test that duplicated work already done. Her coffee had gone lukewarm. She drank it anyway and kept reading. The pattern was clear to anyone trained to look for patterns. And Hannah had been trained to look. To notice. To understand when something didn't add up. Medicare billing codes lined up next to each procedure. Diagnosis codes that justified the cost. Everything documented perfectly. Everything arranged so that if you looked at any single piece, it made sense. But if you looked at the whole picture, if you tracked the progression of orders over time, if you understood which tests were actually indicated and which were just expensive, then what you saw was a surgeon conducting a symphony of procedures on a patient who didn't need most of them. A blind man. A wounded veteran. Someone already written off by most of the staff as damaged goods. What she didn't know yet was that Dr. Sterling had noticed her noticing. Around 0400 hours, Sterling himself appeared on the unit for rounds, unusual for this hour, unusual for him at all since he preferred his patients when families were visiting, when he could perform for an audience. He moved through the ICU with the kind of confidence that came from never being questioned, his shoes clicking against tile in a rhythm that sounded like a metronome counting down to something. He was tall, probably late 50s, with silver hair that looked expensive and a watch that caught the fluorescent light in a way that suggested it cost more than Hannah's monthly rent. She'd watched him work for 8 months now. Watched the way he treated the nursing staff like they were furniture. Watched the way he conducted rounds by talking at patients instead of to them. Watched the way his smile never quite reached his eyes. He stopped at the nurse's station without acknowledging her directly. Just stood there, reviewing charts with a pen in his hand, and she felt the weight of his attention shift in her direction like someone turning a spotlight. Not looking, but aware. She kept her eyes on the monitor in front of her, the one showing Ramirez's cardiac rhythm, steady, consistent, sinus rhythm holding at 68 beats per minute, and she didn't move. Didn't react. The kind of stillness that comes from training. The kind that makes you invisible when you're standing right in front of someone. The Ramirez chart, Sterling said to no one in particular, though they both knew he was speaking to her. Very thorough notes. Nurse Clark, isn't it? Yes, doctor. How long have you worked in critical care? The question was casual. The kind of small talk a supervisor makes when they're evaluating someone. Hannah had answered it before, at interviews, at orientation. At the moment Sterling had barely glanced at her on her first shift. 8 months at Mercy General, she said. Prior experience in emergency medicine. She didn't mention the prior experience had been at Forward Operating Base Shank, that the emergency medicine had involved treating injuries sustained under direct fire, that her hands had learned to work fast and clean in places where the power could go out at any moment. She just said, emergency medicine, and let it sit there like a simple fact. Sterling made a sound, not quite a laugh, more like the noise someone makes when they've just confirmed something they suspected. Emergency background explains the documentation style, he said. Very precise. Almost military in its organization. But we work differently here, Clark. This is a teaching hospital. Patients benefit from a personal touch. Charts should tell a story, not read like a technical manual. He set her chart down with a small tap that made it clear he was done with the conversation, though he paused before walking away. Keep that in mind going forward. Hannah nodded without looking at him. Of course, doctor. She waited until his shoes clicked away down the corridor, past Ramirez's room, where she heard him mutter something about the spinal tap being moved up, essential for diagnosis, first thing when day shift starts, and then she let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. But it wasn't fear. It wasn't anxiety. It was recognition. The same feeling she'd gotten the first time she realized someone on the unit was running an operation, operating according to logic that didn't match the surface story, conducting himself with the confidence of someone who believed he owned the place. The thing about people who'd been trained to survive in hostile environments was that they recognized hostility, even when it wore a white coat and carried a stethoscope. Even when it moved with absolute confidence through a hospital at 0400 hours, certain that no one on the night shift had the authority or the will to question what he was doing. Hannah would sit with that recognition for the next 3 hours, watching monitors, updating charts, and understanding with absolute clarity that she was now operating on 2 levels at once. The surface level where she was just a quiet night shift nurse doing her job. And the deeper level where she was a senior chief petty officer watching a tactical problem develop, recognizing the pattern, and understanding that the next move would belong entirely to her. Tuesday morning. 7:53 a.m. The conference room at Mercy General smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness of fluorescent-lit air that never quite refreshed. Hannah sat in the third row, hands folded on the mahogany table, her navy scrubs pressed with military precision. She had read the agenda 3 times. She had memorized every patient file referenced in Sterling's proposed treatment plan. She had waited for this moment since Friday night when she first noticed the pattern. Dr. Sterling stood at the head of the room, his tailored blazer the color of old money, his tie knotted with the kind of casual perfection that only came from never once questioning whether the knot was actually perfect. He was walking through the new admissions, standard procedure, routine approvals, the rubber stamp machine of hospital bureaucracy humming along exactly as designed. 3 unnecessary MRIs. 2 exploratory ultrasounds that clinical data did not support. And then John Ramirez. Blind veteran. Stable on current management. No acute neurological symptoms. No spinal cord injury indicators. Sterling's pen hovered over the chart. Spinal tap on Ramirez. Friday. Prophylactic screening for post-traumatic neural inflammation. Standard protocol for blast injuries. Hannah raised her hand. Small gesture. No drama. Her voice came out steady and low, the kind of steady that filled rooms without raising volume. That's not standard protocol. Ramirez has no fever. No neck stiffness. No elevated white cell count. Spinal tap carries infection risk he doesn't need. His file shows no neurological decline in 3 weeks of hospitalization. The room went quiet. The kind of quiet where you could hear the ventilation system's dry mechanical breathing. Sterling's smile arrived before his words did. It was the smile of a man who had never been questioned by anyone he considered beneath him, and the smile itself was a predatory thing, teeth showing, eyes not participating. "Tell you what, Clark. I bet you don't last the week." He set his pen down with deliberate slowness. "Anyone want to take odds on our little perfectionist here? How long until the stress gets to her?" Laughter rippled through the conference room. Small sounds. Uncomfortable but present. The laughter of people who didn't want to be the next target but were grateful it wasn't them. Hannah watched it happen the way she had watched things happen in Kandahar when the wind shifted and everyone knew what was coming but pretended not to notice. She took one measured breath. The kind of breath that had become muscle memory across 15 years. In through the nose for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Out for 4. When she exhaled, something wet traced down her left cheek, a single tear that escaped before she could contain it. She wiped it without breaking eye contact. Without flinching. Without the faintest tremor in her hand. "I've outlasted worse than you, Doctor." The words came out like a steel door closing. Like a tank idling in a garage, all power held in reserve, all threat compressed into the space between syllables. The conference room became aware very suddenly that something had just shifted weight. Sterling's jaw tightened. He blinked once. His fingers drummed once against the table, then stopped. "Well then. Let's see if you back that up with performance, shall we?" The meeting dissolved. People gathered papers. No one made eye contact with Hannah. She remained seated until the room emptied, then rose and walked to the door with the same unhurried composure that had carried her through worse places than this. Thursday afternoon. The cafeteria. Peak hour. 200 people moving through the space in controlled chaos. Hannah stood in line with her tray, chicken breast, steamed broccoli, unsweetened tea. Sparse. Functional. The kind of meal that asked nothing of the body except fuel. She had turned toward a table in the corner when the contact came from behind. Deliberate. Shoulder check delivered with the kind of precision that only felt accidental to people not trained to recognize precision. Her tray went airborne. Soup can tumbling. Sandwich rotating. Plastic cup following its own physics. Everything hit the tile floor in a cascade of sound and spreading content, the crash of ceramic against tile, the wet splash of soup, coffee spreading across worn linoleum like a stain. The entire cafeteria froze. 200 sets of eyes pivoted toward the sound. Sterling stood 3 feet away, expression frozen in false innocence. "Bit clumsy, aren't we, sweetheart?" His voice carried the lightness of a man making an observation about the weather. "Need help cleaning that up?" He didn't offer his hand. He didn't move to help. He stood with his arms crossed, waiting for her response like a predator waiting for prey to show fear. Hannah knelt. The tile was cold through her scrubs. She began gathering the pieces, the tray first, then the cup, then the food itself. The soup she wiped away with paper towels. Her movements were deliberate and unhurried. No rushing. No embarrassment. No anger flickering across her face. Just a quiet gravity, the kind of composure that comes from having lost and rebuilt yourself more times than most people lose their keys. The cafeteria returned to its baseline noise. Conversations restarted. The moment lost its sharp edges when she refused to provide the reaction Sterling was hunting for. Friday afternoon. The nursing station. Hannah was documenting vitals when Sterling appeared with a patient chart in his hand. His movements had the theatrical quality of a man performing for witnesses, and there were witnesses. 5 of them. All watching from their various stations around the room, all pretending not to watch with the intensity of people watching a car about to hit a barrier at speed. Sterling dropped the chart at her feet. The sound was louder than paper should be. "Pick that up, sweetheart. Or is basic nursing work beneath you?" Hannah looked at the chart. She looked at Sterling. She looked at the 5 witnesses, and in that look was the absolute knowledge that they were all waiting to see if she would break. If the quiet nurse would finally crack under the pressure the way people were supposed to crack when a man with his kind of position decided to apply weight. She picked up the chart slowly, rose to her full height, looked him directly in the eyes, and not with anger, not with fear, but with something far more dangerous. Understanding. Recognition. The look of someone who had finally identified exactly what they were standing next to and found it exactly as small as they suspected. One tear tracked down her right cheek. Just one. Deliberate and slow, like a calculated effect rather than an emotional leak. "I've picked up pieces of better men than you'll ever be, Doctor." Her voice had dropped an octave. The civilian mask slipped for just a moment, and in that moment, Dr. Sterling saw something in her eyes that made his jaw clench so hard she could see the muscle working. Something in her posture shifted. Something in the way she held the chart, not the way a nurse held a chart, but the way someone held a weapon they knew how to use. The way someone held something that could kill if positioned correctly. He took one step backward. An unconscious movement. A reflex. The predator recognizing, for the first time, that it might not be hunting a prey animal at all. Hannah set the chart on the desk without another word. She didn't excuse herself. She didn't apologize. She simply walked to the medication station, resumed her documentation, and when Sterling left the nursing station 30 seconds later, he was moving with the careful steps of a man who had just learned something he didn't want to know. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Hannah had already made her first decision. The decision that would either bury her completely or bring the entire structure of his operation crashing down. And it would come that evening, when a blind veteran with a unit patch sewn inside his jacket lining would grab her wrist during a routine for insertion and ask her a question that would change absolutely everything. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Sterling. The worst part was that he had no idea the clock was already running. The 4 line went in clean. One motion. Hannah's hands moved with the precision that 8 years of operating under fire had burned into muscle memory, needle angled 23 degrees, bevel up, smooth as breathing. Sterile gloves snapped against her wrists. The fluorescent lights above Ramirez's bed cast shadows that made everything below the neck invisible, just shapes and tubes and the steady beep of monitors counting his heartbeat in the darkness of his world. She was already pulling back on the plunger when his hand moved. Fast. Specific. The grip found her wrist with the kind of accuracy that didn't come from random reflex, it came from someone who had trained to locate threats in absolute darkness, whose hands remembered things his eyes would never see again. His fingers pressed against the pulse point in her forearm, 3-point contact. Exactly where she'd anchored herself to steady the needle insertion. "That's a combat medic's 3-point check," Ramirez whispered. Not a question. A recognition. His sightless eyes tracked toward her voice even though he couldn't see her face, and when he spoke again, his jaw was tight. "What unit were you with?" The room was so quiet you could hear the saline dripping into the 4-chamber. Plip. 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 Hannah didn't pull her wrist away. She didn't answer. Instead, she squeezed his hand twice, tap, tap, the old signal that had meant classified across every forward operating base from Kandahar to the Pakistani border. The signal that meant, "I know what you are, and you know what I am, and we don't speak about it where walls have ears." Ramirez's grip loosened. Understanding flickered across his scarred face like light breaking through clouds. His other hand rose to his chest, fingers pressing against the unit patch he wore under his hospital gown, the faded 5th Special Forces Group insignia sewn into the fabric where it would never show to anyone who wasn't looking. Where it would stay hidden until someone who understood found it. "Figured," he said quietly. Sterling kept pushing the spinal tap. Kept saying I needed procedures. Kept trying to move me to different wings. Hannah's jaw tightened. She checked the flow, the saline running clear, his vein accepting the line without resistance. Everything textbook. Everything clean. She didn't speak, but her silence was answer enough. Ramirez had already seen the pattern. Senior chief or not, he'd been tracking the inconsistencies the same way she had, the unnecessary orders, the billing codes that didn't match the diagnoses, the subtle choreography of a man building a case for procedures that would never help him. He knows, Ramirez said. Not a question this time either. Hannah finished securing the tape, her movements precise and measured. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. She removed her gloves one finger at a time, a snap, snap, the sound like small gunshots in the sterile silence. Nurse will bring your pain meds at 2200. Press the call button if you need anything. She was halfway to the door when Ramirez's voice followed her, low and tight. He's not done with you. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. By Friday afternoon, Sterling had already begun constructing his architecture of control like a man pouring concrete over someone's grave. Hannah didn't know yet, wouldn't know for 3 more days, that he had spent Wednesday morning on the phone with a retained investigator named Marcus Hennessy, a former hospital credentialing director who kept a consulting firm running from a strip mall in Virginia Beach and charged $10,000 per investigation. I need everything on Hannah Clark, Sterling had said. His voice on that call was smooth, confident, the voice of a man accustomed to people doing exactly what he asked. Employment history, references, background. I suspect there are gaps. Significant gaps. Hennessy had asked the obvious question, what kind of gaps? The kind that get people fired, Sterling had replied. The kind that disappear into military records when you ask the right questions. Sterling hung up knowing that Hannah's references would be nearly impossible to verify. He hung up knowing that classified military backgrounds left breadcrumbs that looked like employment gaps to anyone not cleared to know the truth. And he hung up knowing that by Monday morning, when Hennessy called back with his findings, Sterling would have exactly what he needed, paper-thin allegations that sounded serious enough to trigger an investigation, vague enough that no one could definitively prove them false without accessing records that didn't officially exist. He had already prepared the second move. Thursday morning, he made a separate call to the hospital CEO, Dr. Patricia Okafor, reaching her at her personal line before she'd even finished her first coffee. His voice carried the measured concern of a colleague looking out for institutional liability. Patricia, I need to speak with you about one of my nursing staff. I'm not making an accusation, I just want to flag something for credentialing's review. Hannah Clark was questioning my treatment orders in a staff meeting yesterday. In front of other physicians. I'm wondering if there might be gaps in her training or references that we should have caught during hiring. These things worry me from a liability standpoint. Okafor, who had 40 years of hospital administration and approximately zero tolerance for suggestions that her credentialing process had failed, had promised to look into it immediately. She'd hung up already thinking about forms and committees, about investigations and documentation trails, all the machinery of institutional self-protection grinding to life on the assumption that where there was smoke, there was fire. Sterling knew there was no fire. There was only Hannah's precise attention to detail and the fact that her background was so classified that the truth of it would never, ever appear in any civilian database. The gaps in her official record weren't red flags, they were exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd spent years erased from the system entirely. But Okafor didn't know that. The CEO saw only a concerning employment history and a nurse with behavioral issues. By Friday at noon, the credentialing department had submitted its first report. References were proving difficult to verify. Several addresses were no longer valid. Previous employers had no record of her employment dates. It looked, on paper, like Hannah Clark was either lying about her background or hiding something significant. It looked like someone they'd made a hiring mistake about. Sterling saved the report to his secure folder alongside the notes Hennessy had already sent, preliminary findings suggesting unexplained employment gaps consistent with classified military background and recommendations for thorough investigation before proceeding with credentialing decisions. 6 pages of official-sounding language that amounted to, "This woman's background doesn't add up, and you should be very careful about trusting her with patient care." By Friday at 2 p.m., Sterling was ready to make his third move, the one that would actually separate Hannah from Ramirez. He walked into Ramirez's room with his clipboard held like a weapon, his white coat perfectly pressed, his expression carrying the exact amount of concern that made people believe what he said. His presence had a quality that made the air itself seem to compress, like a man used to occupying space and having everyone in it adjust to accommodate him. "Mr. Ramirez," Sterling began, his voice smooth as surgical silk. "I've been reviewing your cardiac status, and I think it's time we moved you to our cardiac specialty wing. More intensive monitoring. More experienced staff." He paused, letting the implication hang, "Better care than what you're getting now. I'm arranging the transfer for Monday morning. You'll have a dedicated cardiac team." Ramirez didn't move. His sightless eyes tracked Sterling's voice like sonar picking up a submarine. "I don't need those procedures. Nurse Clark said my last EKG was stable." Nurse Clark, Sterling said, and the way he said the name made it clear he'd already written the ending, "isn't qualified to make cardiac assessments. She's a general duty nurse, and she's been overstepping significantly. In fact, we're going to be reassigning her to orthopedics effective immediately. Spinal Surgery Recovery Unit. It's actually a promotion, more specialized work, more pay." He smiled, and it was the smile of someone who'd already moved 3 pieces on the board and was watching Ramirez realize he was in check. "You'll have different nursing staff. Experienced cardiac nurses. For your safety." Ramirez's hand clenched. The unit patch under his gown suddenly felt visible even though it was hidden, like Sterling's words had burned right through the fabric. "And honestly," Sterling continued, writing something on his clipboard without looking, "I think you'll be much more comfortable with a different care team. There's been some concern about Nurse Clark's clinical judgment. Nothing serious. Just some gaps we're investigating." He placed a form on the bedside table. "You can authorize the transfer here. Breakfast is at 0700. You'll move at 0800 Monday." It wasn't a request. By Thursday afternoon, when Hannah received her reassignment notice, she understood what had happened. The memo was official, pristine, signed by the credentialing director, effective immediately. RN Hannah Clark is reassigned from night shift ICU to day shift orthopedic recovery unit. Please collect your belongings from night shift lockers and report to orthopedic management at 0700 Monday. That night, she sat at her kitchen table with Emma, her 16-year-old daughter who'd inherited her mother's ability to see through walls. The kitchen smelled like the chicken they hadn't eaten, and the only sound was the refrigerator's mechanical hum and the rain hammering against the windows like something trying to get in. "Mom, why do you let him push you around?" Emma asked. She was doing calculus homework that she didn't need to do, busy work to avoid the real conversation, the one they both knew was happening. "You're like? I don't know. You're the strongest person I know. And you let some guy in a white coat tell you what to do." Hannah's hands were folded on the table. She looked at them for a long moment, hands that had held a defibrillator steady over a man's chest in a concrete bunker, hands that had signed weapons out of armories and practiced 3-point medical checks until the motion became as automatic as breathing. Hands that were now supposed to believe they belonged to a general duty nurse who overstepped. "Some battles aren't about fighting," Hannah said quietly. "Some battles are about timing. About knowing when to move and when to stay still. About keeping your head down so you can see the whole board." But that wasn't really true. The truth was that her own background, the parts of it that were classified, the parts that would always be classified, the parts that existed in redacted files in Pentagon buildings she'd never even been allowed to walk into, had created exactly the kind of employment gaps that made her look like a liar now. The truth was that Sterling had found the one weapon that would work against her, the fact that she couldn't explain her own background without explaining things that weren't hers to explain. "I have to accept the transfer," Hannah said. "And I need you to understand why I can't tell you everything about why." Emma looked at her mother across the table and saw, for the first time, the weight of something much heavier than a bad boss. She saw someone caught between worlds, unable to claim the one she'd actually lived in. That was when Hannah's phone buzzed. Unknown number. She didn't answer it. She never answered unknown numbers. But that night, something shifted in her chest, a recognition that the clock Sterling had been running wasn't the one that mattered anymore. Someone else had already started their own countdown. The code blue alert came through the overhead speaker at 11:47 on a Friday night. Room for 08. Cardiac care. Hannah was 3 floors down in orthopedics when the intercom crackled to life, and her body recognized what her mind hadn't processed yet, the particular pitch of that alarm, the specific cadence of urgency. She moved before she made the conscious decision to move. The stairwell door swung open under her hand like it had been waiting for her, and she took the steps 2 at a time, muscle memory from a field hospital in Kandahar where hesitation cost lives. The cardiac unit erupted as she burst through the doors. A cardiac monitor shrieked its flatline warning. 2 nurses pumped chest compressions in perfect rhythm while a resident stood frozen over an ultrasound screen, his face the color of wet concrete. The patient was John Ramirez. Of course it was John Ramirez. Hannah's vision narrowed to tunnel focus, the way it always did when the world compressed down to the space between life and death. The attending physician, Dr. Paulson, looked up from the monitor and shook his head once, a gesture heavy with defeat. Massive pericardial effusion. Cardiac tamponade. Blood's filling the sac around his heart. He needs immediate pericardiocentesis or he crashes permanently in. He checked his watch with the hollow expression of a man counting down someone else's last minutes, 4 minutes. Cardiothoracic is 20 minutes out. Maybe 18 if we're lucky. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Hannah moved to the supply cart before anyone could speak. She knew exactly where the needle was because she had known exactly where it was in a collapsing field hospital in Paktia province, in a tent under mortar fire, in situations where the closest backup was a radio operator calling in coordinates to airstrikes. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't quicken. She pulled an 18-gauge needle, extended it to a spinal needle with perfect precision, and began prepping the insertion site while Dr. Paulson stared at her like she was speaking Mandarin. "You don't have authorization," he started, but Hannah was already palpating the space between ribs, visualizing the anatomy the way surgeons dream in anatomical diagrams. 5th intercostal space. Mid-axillary line. The window to the pericardium. Her hands moved the way hands move when they've done this task 100 times, and the cost of failure is watching someone die in front of you. "He dies in 4 minutes if we wait," she said. Not a question. Not a request. A statement of fact delivered in a voice that sounded like it was coming from somewhere very far away and very long ago. She didn't look at Dr. Paulson. She looked at John Ramirez's blind eyes, open and terrified, his body convulsing under the compressions, and she saw the recognition there. He knew. Even sightless, he recognized what she was about to do. The trust in that moment, the absolute absence of doubt, was heavier than any medal. The needle went in with a kind of certainty that only comes from having no other choice. The syringe pulled back and 200 milliliters of blood came with it, dark and urgent and alive. The moment that blood released the pressure around his heart was the moment his monitor began to change. The flat line broke into small, irregular beats. The compressions continued, but now there was somewhere for his heart to work. 60 seconds. 85. 100. The beats became rhythmic, then strong, then steady. Sinus rhythm. 102 beats per minute. His color shifted from the gray of the nearly dead to the pink of someone who had been given back their oxygen. His back, someone whispered. His back, Hannah confirmed, stepping away from the monitor with the same calm she'd carried into the room. She discarded the needle into the sharps container. She peeled off her gloves. She looked at Dr. Paulson, who was staring at her with the expression of a man watching someone pull off a mask he'd never known they were wearing. Around them, the unit erupted into controlled chaos, nurses adjusting lines, the resident calling cardiothoracic with an update, orders being written for imaging and blood work, and the cascade of interventions that follow a save like this. Hannah turned to leave. "Wait," Dr. Paulson said. His voice had changed. It was quieter now, and something in it sounded like fear. Not fear of Ramirez's condition, but fear of understanding that he was standing across from someone whose capabilities existed several pay grades above his own. That was extraordinary. You just performed an emergency pericardiocentesis without authorization from. He needed it, Hannah said simply. She was already moving toward the door. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing as she walked back down to orthopedics and clocked out at 5 minutes past 1 in the morning, was that Dr. Sterling had been informed of the code blue 17 minutes after it was called. He had been informed because Dr. Sterling kept his finger on every pulse at Mercy General that mattered to him, and he had immediately understood what Hannah's intervention meant. It meant his star billing case, the disabled veteran he'd been cultivating for months to justify increasingly expensive imaging and treatment protocols, had been saved by the one person whose presence at his bedside Sterling had specifically orchestrated away. It meant Hannah had overstepped authorization in a way that was simultaneously medically brilliant and administratively indefensible. It meant Sterling had been handed a weapon. He made 3 phone calls that night from his home office while nursing a glass of Macallan 18-year single malt. The first was to the hospital board president's private line. The second was to a retained investigator who owed him for separate favors. The third was to the director of nursing with instructions that sounded like a professional concern but were actually the beginning of a narrative. By the time the sun came up on Saturday morning, the story had changed. It wasn't a save anymore. It was a nurse practicing beyond her scope of authority. It was a patient at risk because of hubris. It was a liability that needed to be documented with military precision. The investigator spent Sunday cross-referencing Hannah's personnel file, building a timeline of the credentialing gaps that Sterling had already seeded there months ago. Her employment history had holes that made sense if you didn't ask the right questions. References that were vague but not suspiciously so. A background check that was missing certain components because certain components didn't exist in any database a civilian investigator could access. By Monday morning at 8:30, there was a folder on the hospital administrator's desk with her name on it, and that folder contained the airtight case for termination that Dr. Sterling had been constructing since the moment Hannah first challenged him. Hannah was called to the Human Resources office at 9:03 on Monday morning. She was escorted by a security guard who wouldn't meet her eyes. The administrator sat behind her desk with the file open in front of her, and Hannah could see the thickness of it, the accumulation of documentation that Sterling had been gathering like he was building a case for something far more serious than a single procedure. The administrator read the summary aloud, practicing beyond scope of authorization, failure to follow chain of command, reckless endangerment of patient safety, suspicious credentialing gaps that suggested resume fraud, concerns about her background verification. With each charge, Hannah's understanding of what had happened crystallized. Sterling hadn't just built a case. He had built it impeccably. She didn't defend herself. There was nothing to defend against. The technical fact was that she had performed a procedure without specific authorization from the attending physician. The technical fact was that she had not waited for cardiothoracic. The technical fact was that John Ramirez was alive and stable and heading toward full cardiac recovery because of what she'd done, but that technical fact didn't matter anymore because it had been subsumed into a larger technical fact: procedure, authorization, scope, liability. At 10:15 in the morning, Hannah was escorted from the building by the same security guard. Her badge was deactivated in front of her. The administrator used words like separation of employment and effective immediately and final paycheck. Hannah took the envelope with her termination paperwork and walked to the parking lot where her 10-year-old Honda Civic was waiting with the same patience it always had. She drove home in silence. Emma found her at 2 in the afternoon, still in her scrubs, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Her daughter was 16 years old and had seen her mother injured, exhausted, angry, and overwhelmed by the sheer volume of human suffering that came with the job. But she had never seen her mother cry. Hannah Clark did not cry. Hannah Clark did not fall apart. Hannah Clark was the person other people cried in front of, the steady presence that held people together when everything else was fragmenting. Mom. Emma's voice cracked the silence like glass. Why are you home? Hannah looked at her daughter and felt something in her chest fracture. How could she explain that the one mission she'd been ordered to disappear into, the classified operation in 2019 that had gone sideways in ways that still lived in her nightmares, the deep cover identity that had kept her safe and invisible and untouchable, that all of it had been for nothing? She had spent 8 months being nobody. She had let people dismiss her and demean her and push her into corners because that was the mission. The mission was to be invisible. The mission was to disappear so completely that her real self became just a ghost wearing scrubs. But the invisibility hadn't protected her. It had made her vulnerable. It had given Sterling exactly the blank canvas he needed to paint whatever narrative suited his purposes. I got fired, Hannah said quietly. Emma's face went white. What? Why? You saved that patient on Friday night. Everyone's talking about it. They said you were amazing. They said you were like some kind of... Yes, Hannah interrupted. Not unkindly, but with the finality of someone who had already made peace with something. And apparently that's the same thing as being insubordinate. She looked out the kitchen window at the rain that had started without her noticing. Somewhere in the city, John Ramirez was recovering. Somewhere in his house, Dr. Sterling was probably already strategizing his next move, already thinking about how to leverage this termination into something more, how to use Hannah's absence as an opportunity. And somewhere in the grey afternoon light, the clock that Sterling had been running was still ticking down toward something neither of them could yet see. But Hannah felt it coming. She felt the shift in the air the way you feel a storm building on the horizon when you've spent enough time in open country. She closed her eyes and waited. The wind shifted at 10:04 a.m. on a Tuesday. Hannah felt it first, the change in air pressure that comes when something massive is about to land. The rotor wash hit the parking lot like a physical force, shaking the windows of Mercy General's East Wing, rattling for stands in patient rooms, sending coffee cups sliding across nurses' stations. 3 UH-60M Blackhawks descended through the morning sky in perfect formation, their shadows crossing the building like the hand of judgment. News vans that had been idling near the main entrance suddenly came alive. Cameras swung upward. Anchors straightened their spines. Nobody knew what was coming, but everyone could feel it landing. The convoy pulled up to the main entrance 90 seconds later. Black Suburbans, windows tinted, rolled to a stop with the precision of machinery that had performed this maneuver 1,000 times. 24 Special Forces operators in dress uniforms emerged in synchronized silence, desert tan shirts pressed sharp enough to cut, boots polished to mirrors, and they formed a corridor from the main doors all the way to the elevator bank. Not aggressive. Respectful. The kind of respect you show when you're honoring something sacred. Emma was still in the parking garage when she heard the rotors. She felt her stomach drop before her brain caught up. She ran toward the sound, toward the windows, toward the commotion growing louder by the second. By the time she reached the lobby, news cameras were already rolling. By the time she pushed through the crowd, a SEAL commander was walking through the doors. His name tape read Clayton. His chest held ribbons Hannah recognized, bronze with oak leaf clusters, purple with white borders, the kind of medals that meant he had bled on foreign soil and walked away from it. His voice when he spoke carried the kind of authority that made people step backward without knowing why. I'm looking for Senior Chief Clark. Not a request. Not even a question. A simple statement delivered the way you state facts about gravity or oxygen. The room froze. The administrator, a woman named Patricia who had signed Hannah's termination letter at 9:24 that morning, went white. The hospital security guard reached for his radio and then stopped, as if remembering that radio protocol didn't apply to whatever this was. Emma's eyes locked on her mother. Hannah stood near the triage desk, chart in her hands, wearing the same scrub she'd worn every night for 8 months. The same scrub she'd planned to never wear again after this shift. When Commander Clayton's eyes found her, something shifted in his face, recognition, respect, the subtle head nod that operators used to acknowledge another operator. He walked toward her. The corridor of uniforms adjusted as he moved, creating a pathway that had never existed in this hospital before. Emma pushed forward, trying to reach her mother, trying to understand what was happening, and the operators, these massive, decorated men, parted to let her through. "Mom." Emma's voice cracked. He said, "Senior Chief." "Mom," he said. "I know, baby. I know." Hannah's hands trembled. For the first time in 19 years, her hands trembled. Not from fear. From restraint. From the effort of containing something that had been locked away so tightly that the release felt like it might break her in half. She set the chart down with careful precision. "Stay close." Patricia was already moving toward them, her tablet clutched to her chest like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Her assistant, a young man named Derek, followed, his face matching the color of the hospital walls. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clark," Patricia began, her voice shaking in a way that suggested she'd just remembered she was breathing. I have a declassified summary here that just arrived from the Pentagon. I need to read this to you. And to everyone." She looked at Commander Clayton. He nodded once. Patricia's hands trembled as she touched the tablet screen. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clark, United States Navy. Navy Cross recipient for actions during Operation Silent Avalanche, 2019. Personally responsible for saving 43 coalition lives during a classified operation in the Kandahar province. Carried out the most successful medical evacuation under fire in Special Operations Command history." Patricia's voice broke on the last word. She kept going. "Clearance level TSSCI commended for Valor. Status, classified. Re-entry to civilian medical service authorized pending institutional vetting." The rotor wash from the Blackhawks outside had finally stopped, but the silence it left behind felt louder. Commander Clayton stepped forward. When he spoke, his voice had the texture of someone delivering a eulogy, respectful, heavy with weight. "John Ramirez." He pulled a photograph from his jacket, old, worn, the kind of photo that gets folded and refolded until it's soft as cloth. It showed a group of soldiers in desert camouflage, faces covered in dust, all of them smiling the way you smile when you know you just survived something that was supposed to kill you. Staff Sergeant John Ramirez, 5th Special Forces Group. Served for tours. Lost his sight to an IED in Sanjin Valley. The same valley where Senior Chief Clark was operating. He pointed to a figure in the back of the photo. "Right there." He pulled out another piece of evidence, this one smaller, more precious. Inside a plastic evidence bag was a jacket lining, and sewn into that lining was a patch. Faded. Worn. The colors had bleached to near invisibility, but the unit designation was still visible to anyone who knew how to read it. 5th Special Forces Group. Command Sergeant Major rank insignia. Combat Infantryman badge. John Ramirez sewed his unit patch into his jacket lining the day he deployed. That patch is how he knew. A blind man recognized a comrade through a single detail most people would never notice. But Senior Chief Clark, she recognized him the moment he intercepted her for insertion with a combat 3-point check. She saw one of her own being hunted, and she put herself between him and danger. That's what you do in the teams. You don't leave people behind. The words hung in the air like smoke. Patricia was shaking now, genuinely shaking, as if the ground beneath the hospital was shifting and she was only now feeling it. Derek had his phone out, recording. Every news anchor in the lobby was recording. That was when the 3-star admiral walked in. He was older, his hair white, his uniform so perfectly tailored it looked painted on. His name was Admiral Morrison, and his face carried the kind of authority that made generals straighten their spines. 2 FBI agents in blue windbreakers flanked him, their faces blank in that way that federal agents cultivate. Behind them came a woman in a tailored suit who introduced herself as Special Agent Rodriguez, FBI Fraud Division. Dr. Marcus Sterling. The Admiral's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. 6 weeks ago, Senior Chief Clark's meticulous charting patterns, every procedure she questioned, every order she flagged, every patient she advocated for was forwarded to federal authorities by a whistleblower. That documentation became the foundation of an investigation into your billing practices at Mercy General over the past 7 years. Sterling arrived through the side entrance at that exact moment, his expensive suit catching the light, his face in that moment before he realized what was happening registering his usual confidence. The confidence evaporated when he saw the Admiral. "You have submitted false Medicare claims totaling $984,000, Special Agent Rodriguez continued, reading from a tablet. "You have targeted vulnerable populations, specifically blind and disabled veterans, for unnecessary procedures that generated $62,000 in personal profit. You have deliberately isolated patients from advocates who might question your medical judgment. You have committed wire fraud, conspiracy, and Medicare fraud." Sterling's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. The Admiral continued, his voice steady, relentless, the voice of an institution that does not break and does not bend. "Your medical license is suspended effective immediately, pending permanent revocation. Your hospital privileges are terminated. You are banned from practicing medicine in any hospital receiving federal funding." That's every hospital in this state. Patricia, still holding her tablet, looked between Sterling and Hannah. The administrator's face underwent a visible reorganization as she understood the scope of what had just happened. She had fired an innocent woman and kept a criminal. Her career just ended. She didn't know it yet, but it did. Security moved toward Sterling as the FBI agents reached for handcuffs. Sterling tried to speak, his expensive lawyer, already in the building because someone had warned him, appearing at his side, but there was nothing left to say. No speech could save him. No network could protect him. The news cameras caught everything. The moment his wrists were cuffed. The moment he saw Hannah standing there, still in her scrubs, surrounded by the people he'd tried to have her believe were her enemy. The moment his face collapsed into something smaller, uglier, the face of a man who had just understood that he was not powerful after all. "You tried to destroy a decorated war hero to protect your profit margin," Commander Clayton said, his voice carrying to every corner of the lobby. "You fabricated evidence. You weaponized confidential information. You threw charts at a Navy Cross recipient and called her sweetheart. You made a mistake." The convoy escorted Sterling out. The news vans followed. By 11:41 a.m., every news outlet in Virginia was running the headline, "Federal Investigation Ends Surgeon's Career at Mercy General." By noon, the story had spread nationally. By evening, Sterling's name was synonymous with predatory medical fraud. Emma wrapped her arms around her mother and held on. Hannah's arms came around her daughter, and for the first time since Emma was 7 years old, her mother cried in front of her. Not the silent tears of control. Real tears. Tears that came from a place so deep they'd been locked away for 23 years. "Why didn't you tell me?" Emma whispered. Hannah pressed her forehead against her daughter's. "Because I was ordered to disappear, baby. I had to become invisible. But some things you can't hide forever. Some things won't let you." Commander Clayton approached them, and Hannah straightened. The transition was visible, civilian mother to military officer, a shift that moved through her body like light through water. He extended his hand, and she took it, and he didn't shake it the way civilians shake hands. He held it. An acknowledgement. A welcome home. "We're standing up a veterans crisis unit here," Admiral Morrison said, joining them. "We need someone to run it. Someone who understands what it means to be hunted by the system that's supposed to protect you. Someone who won't compromise, won't walk away, and won't stop fighting for people who can't fight for themselves." Hannah looked at her daughter. Emma nodded before her mother could even ask. "I'll do it," Hannah said. Her voice had changed. It wasn't the timid voice that Dr. Sterling heard. It was the voice of someone who had survived things that were supposed to be unsurvivable, and who had decided that her survival meant something. 6 months later, the plaque outside the new Veterans Crisis Unit at Mercy General read, "Clark Center for Combat Veteran Care. Director, Senior Chief Hannah Clark, USN, Ret." Inside, morning rounds happened with the precision of a military operation, 2 former Army medics, a Marine corpsman, and Hannah, moving through patient rooms with the kind of competence that only comes from understanding what it costs to survive. John Ramirez worked as a peer counselor. His sight had improved with proper care, the original diagnosis had been rushed, incomplete, another victim of Sterling's indifference. He could navigate the unit now without a cane, his hand on Hannah's shoulder as they moved through hallways. He was learning all over again. On her office wall hung a photograph that had been packed away in a box for 4 years. Her team in Kandahar. Dust and blood and exhausted triumph captured in a single frame. Emma came by after school sometimes, volunteering, finally understanding her mother's silences in a way that made sense. Across town, in a strip mall between a tax service and a shuttered restaurant, Marcus Sterling sat at a folding table with a banner reading supplemental insurance. His medical license, permanently revoked. His network, scattered under investigation. His legacy, a cautionary tale about mistaking quiet dignity for weakness. Hannah walked the unit's corridors at night sometimes, checking on veterans who couldn't sleep, and she moved with the same steady competence she'd carried into this hospital 8 months ago. But now her dog tags hung visible at her collar for the first time. Now the scars on her hands could be shown. Now the stories behind them could finally be told. The badge on her scrubs read the same thing it had always read, nurse. But nobody who'd been in that lobby on Tuesday would ever make that mistake again. If you've ever felt invisible when you know you're strong enough to move mountains, subscribe and let me know. Like this video if you believe in quiet heroes. And comment, what would you have done if you were Hannah, watching someone hunt the people you'd sworn to protect? The answer might surprise you.